Hey guys, ready for another Last Climb episode? Today's story takes us high onto the deadly slopes of K2, where a couple made one decision that every experienced climber knows never to make. A veteran climber warned them, but they brushed him off and kept climbing. A short time later, K2 proved exactly why some warnings are written in blood. It was August 3rd, 2023. Everything that happened on that mountain that day traces back to a forecast, a narrow gap in the weather that every single team on K2 had been circling like sharks for weeks. Dozens of climbers from different expeditions were finally getting the green light to go for the summit, and for two of them, a couple, this was supposed to be the crowning achievement of nearly a decade of climbing together. Let me introduce you to the two people at the center of this incident. Shugo Takao was 46 years old, a structural engineer from Yokohama, Japan. Maria Lucia Morales was 44, an architect from Zaragoza, Spain. Someone who spent her career designing spaces for people to live in and, in her free time, chased some of the least livable places on Earth. They'd built a life together in Spain, but their relationship didn't start there. It started 8 years earlier on an alpine skills course in the French Alps, of all places, where two strangers roped up together and discovered they liked being scared in the mountains with each other more than they liked being comfortable anywhere else. That's a very specific kind of chemistry, and I think anyone who's ever fallen for someone over a shared obsession understands it immediately. From that course onward, their relationship and their climbing basically grew up together. They weren't messing around either. Over the following years, they knocked out guided ascents of Mont Blanc, Gran Paradiso, the Breithorn, plus a handful of technical alpine routes that require real skill, real fitness, and real trust in your partner. More recently, they'd added Aconcagua to that resume, a real taste of altitude and thin air, though nothing that fully prepares a climber for what an 8,000 meter peak demands. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters a lot for how this story unfolds. These two were not reckless amateurs who wandered onto the second highest mountain on the planet without a clue. They were not weekend warriors either. They were competent, disciplined climbers who always brought in local guides for the big objectives. That detail is going to become almost painfully ironic by the end of this episode. K2 was the next logical step, or at least it felt that way to them. It's the move so many serious mountaineers eventually make, chasing something bigger than the Alps could offer. And so instead of trying to go it alone, they did what smart climbers do. They booked with a commercial expedition, reputable by most accounts. The package included one Pakistani high-altitude guide and one high-altitude porter, both assigned specifically to support their summit push. On paper, this was a well-planned, well-supported attempt by two capable climbers. That's actually one of the most unsettling parts of this whole story. We like to tell ourselves that tragedy on these mountains happens to the reckless ones, the ones who skip steps, who go without guides, who ignore warnings. But sometimes the mountain doesn't care how many boxes you checked. Their guide was 38-year-old Imran Ali, a seasoned Pakistani high-altitude specialist who had already stood on K2's summit multiple times. He worked for one of the more budget-friendly operators on the mountain, which is worth mentioning because K2 expeditions run a huge range in price, and the cheaper packages often mean fewer guides stretched across more clients. Less redundancy if something goes wrong. Even so, Imran had been assigned to Shugo and Lucia alone that day, no other client splitting his attention, which meant whatever happened later would come down to timing and judgment, not staffing math. Alongside Imran was 29-year-old Karim Hussein, the porter assigned to the pair, carrying spare oxygen bottles and emergency supplies for their summit day. Neither Imran nor Karim knew it yet, but they were about to become the two most important eyewitnesses to a tragedy that would end up being picked apart by investigators, journalists, and honestly, people like me, sitting here trying to make sense of it months later. I think it's worth sitting on that budget detail for a second, because it's the kind of thing that never makes it into the highlight reel of a climb like this. Commercial K2 expeditions can cost wildly different amounts depending on the operator, and the price tag isn't just about comfort. It's about staffing ratios, about how many guides are watching, how many clients, about how much slack exists in the system if two things go wrong at once instead of one. Shugo and Lucia weren't cutting corners recklessly. They were experienced enough to know what they needed and confident that one dedicated guide and one dedicated porter would be enough support for two strong, capable climbers. In most seasons, on most days, that math works out fine. This wasn't most days. Here's the thing about that particular weather window in early August of 2023. It wasn't just a good day. It was one of maybe a handful of legitimately climbable stretches the entire season had offered. Weeks of storms, high winds, and general misery had kept teams pinned down at various camps, and when the forecast finally cleared, it wasn't just Shugo and Lucia's team that decided to go. It was basically everyone. Every commercial operator on the mountain, every independent climber, all converging on the same route at the same time because nobody wanted to be the team that waited for a window that might never come again. And if you know anything about mountaineering, you already know where this is going. When everybody moves at once on a route as narrow and exposed as K2's, you get bottlenecks. Actual, physical, human traffic jams thousands of feet above sea level in air so thin your brain is functioning at a fraction of its normal capacity.
I don't think people fully grasp how dangerous a traffic jam becomes when it's happening on a knife-edge ridge instead of a highway.
During the acclimatization rotations up the Abruzzi Spur, they were by every account model climbers. They followed instructions. They didn't cut corners. They made friends easily, hanging around Camp 2 and Camp 3 with climbers from completely different expeditions, swapping stories, sharing food, doing the kind of bonding that happens naturally when you're all suffering together at altitude. Shugo, true to his engineering brain, became something of an unofficial camp handyman, fixing gear, tightening straps, solving little mechanical problems that popped up constantly in that environment. Lucia carried her camera everywhere, snapping photos of other climbers in candid moments and making a point of sharing the pictures with them afterward. Expedition staff who worked with them described them consistently as polite, cooperative, and physically strong. These were likable people.
I think that matters. It's easy to turn tragedy into a morality tale where the victims did something obviously wrong and we get to feel superior and safe. This isn't that kind of story.
But likability doesn't cancel out physics, and it doesn't cancel out inexperience with a mountain that operates on a completely different level than anything they'd touched before. Even with their alpine resume, both of them started to realize during acclimatization that K2 was punishing them in ways Mont Blanc never had. Above 26,000 feet, just moving your body forward, one boot in front of the other, started to feel like an enormous, almost absurd effort. They joked about it at first, the kind of dark, exhausted humor climbers use to cope, saying they never imagined a mountain could make experienced people feel like total beginners again. I actually find that detail kind of haunting in hindsight, because it wasn't really a joke. It was their bodies quietly telling them something true, and jokes are often how we deflect information we're not ready to sit with. And then there was the waiting. Weeks of it. Poor weather, delay after delay, food quality degrading the longer everyone sat around camp, fatigue accumulating in a way that doesn't fully reset even with rest days at altitude. This kind of prolonged expedition wears down more than muscles. It wears down patience, judgment, emotional reserves. Morale sagged across the whole mountain, not just their team. And by the time the forecast finally opened up, Summit Day carried this enormous emotional weight because everyone understood, on some level, that this might be the only shot they'd get. When you combine physical depletion with emotional desperation and then add hundreds of other climbers all feeling the exact same pressure at the exact same time, you've built the conditions for something to go wrong. Nobody has to be careless for that recipe to turn dangerous. It just has to exist. Summit Day started shortly before midnight. Climbers streaming out of Camp 4 under a clear sky with winds that were considered acceptable, even good, by K2's brutal standards. And almost immediately, long lines began forming along the fixed ropes. This is the reality of modern, high-altitude mountaineering that doesn't always make it into the glossy summit photos. You're not climbing a mountain, you're queuing on one, sharing a single, narrow rope system with climbers of wildly different skill levels and speeds. Shugo, for his part, started out patient. Lucia even encouraged slower climbers ahead of them whenever the line stalled, which tells you something about who she was as a person and as a climber. But hours ticked by. Their oxygen, calculated and rationed for a certain pace, was burning faster than planned because standing still on a nearly vertical ice face while gasping for air still uses gas, maybe more than moving does.
Can you imagine that image? Hundreds of feet up a mountain wall, clipped to a rope, unable to move, watching your oxygen gauge tick down while you wait for a stranger ahead of you to figure out their next step.
That's not a minor inconvenience. On K2, that's a countdown. I want to point out something that I think gets lost whenever people tell stories like this one. It's tempting to look for the moment where things went wrong, like there's one clean turning point you can circle in red. But the truth is messier. The oxygen math didn't break because of one bad decision. It broke slowly, minute by minute, every time the line stopped and Shugo and Lucia had to just stand there, motionless, on terrain steep enough that a wrong step could send them sliding, breathing bottled air. They'd budgeted for movement, not for waiting. Multiply that by hours, and you get a version of the summit push, where your body is already quietly writing checks your reserves can't cash later in the day. Nobody feels that happening in real time. You just feel a little more tired than expected, a little more anxious than expected, and you keep climbing anyway because turning around feels unthinkable after weeks of waiting for this exact window. Somewhere in that slow-moving column was a 50-year-old Czech mountaineer named Gleb Bortnik, climbing independently with another team. Gleb had serious Himalayan mileage behind him, and multiple climbers who'd crossed paths with him described the same thing. An almost stubborn, deliberate pace, no matter what chaos was happening around him. While Shugo and Lucia were burning nervous energy trying to close gaps in the line, Gleb was steadily, quietly, gaining ground on them without ever looking like he was hurrying. There's something almost symbolic about that, in retrospect. A tortoise and hare dynamic playing out at 26,000 feet, except nobody involved knew yet which role they were actually playing. As the route pushed toward the bottleneck, that infamous, terrifying stretch of steep ice sitting directly beneath a massive, unstable hanging serac, the congestion got dramatically worse. This is widely considered the single most dangerous section on the entire mountain, a place where you're supposed to move fast and decisively, not stand around. But standing around is exactly what dozens of climbers were doing, struggling with the terrain, slowing everyone behind them. Their guide heard Shugo tell Lucia that if they kept moving at this pace, they might reach the summit dangerously late. She agreed. They needed to take any opening that appeared. I want to be really clear here. They weren't racing anyone. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were scared, in a very rational way, of missing the weather window entirely and getting caught descending in the dark. That fear was legitimate. The mountain simply didn't care that their fear was legitimate. So whenever a gap opened ahead of them, Shugo would carefully move past the slower climber, always staying clipped into the fixed rope while he did it. Imran didn't just remind them, he told them plainly to stop passing people, slow their pace, and conserve what oxygen they had left. Shugo would nod, acknowledge the advice, and then keep doing exactly what he'd been doing whenever the chance came up.
That's such a human contradiction, isn't it? Agreeing with good advice in the moment and then acting on the fear underneath it instead.
Karim later recalled that both climbers were breathing far harder than they had been lower on the mountain, a physical tell that their reserves were already dipping into dangerous territory. Their patience was gone.
And here's the part that I think is genuinely the crux of this entire tragedy. Exhaustion doesn't just tire out your muscles.
It quietly, invisibly corrodes your judgment, and it does it without announcing itself. You don't feel your decision-making getting worse. You just start making worse decisions and feeling completely justified about each one. Near the bottleneck, Gleb finally caught up to the couple. He noticed Shugo attempting to push past another slow-moving climber during a brief gap in traffic, and he called out to him between labored breaths in broken but understandable English.
I'm not going to hand you his exact words because I don't have them verbatim, but the substance of what he communicated was short and blunt.
They were burning too much, too fast. Slow down. Save it for the descent. The summit was only halfway. Shugo thanked him. He was polite about it, genuinely. There's no indication this was some tense confrontation. But he replied that they'd already lost too much time waiting in line and didn't want to lose more. Lucia added that they just wanted to stay ahead of the growing crowd building up beneath the serac. Gleb, still calm, repeated that everyone on that mountain was feeling the exact same pressure he was describing, and that arriving at the summit late would only make the descent more dangerous, not less. Nobody raised their voice, nobody stormed off. It was a respectful exchange between people who, in another context, might have shared a beer and laughed about this later. But Shugo and Lucia had probably crossed some internal threshold where exhaustion had curdled their frustration into a kind of tunnel vision determination. They seemed to genuinely believe, in that moment, that keeping momentum was the safer choice, not the riskier one. Imran didn't side with Gleb quietly. He told them flatly to slow down, stop passing, and accept the delay, warning that they were burning oxygen they would need later. Shugo told him they were feeling strong enough and wanted to keep moving while the weather held. Kareem, reflecting on it afterward, said they looked mentally exhausted, and yet somehow more determined than ever to make every remaining minute count. Several more hours of climbing later, Shugo and Lucia finally reached the summit at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Imran didn't keep his concern to himself. 2 o'clock was late, dangerously late, and he told them so directly, urging them to keep it short and start down immediately. Objectively, the weather was still holding well enough to allow for an immediate descent, and that would have been the textbook move. Snap a few photos, take it in for a minute or two, and turn around. Instead, the emotional floodgates opened. This was the culmination of years of training, years of smaller summits building toward this one, a shared dream between two people who'd fallen for each other, partly because of this exact obsession. They hugged, they cried, they filmed short videos to send home to family, the kind of clips that are heartbreaking to watch now, knowing what came next. They had Kareem photograph them together against the summit ridge, prayer flags snapping in the wind behind them. All told, they spent roughly 20 minutes up there, celebrating, soaking it in, while Imran repeatedly urged them to start moving. Eventually, they listened and began the descent. But as they turned to head down, clouds were already starting to build lower on the mountain, and shadows were stretching long and dark across the upper slopes. 20 minutes doesn't sound like much until you remember that on K2's death zone, every single minute is borrowed against a body that's actively dying at that altitude. Slowly, cell by cell, no matter how strong or well-trained you are. The mountain was never going to send them an invoice for those 20 minutes. It was just going to collect the payment later, without warning, at a moment they wouldn't get to choose. Within the first hour of descending, both climbers noticeably slowed down. Their movements lost coordination, small stumbles, hesitations, that unmistakable sluggishness of a body running on fumes. They needed frequent rests, and their oxygen supply kept dwindling with every passing minute. Making things worse, traffic on the descent had become even more chaotic than it had been on the way up, because now climbers from multiple expeditions were coming down at the same time that some slower climbers were still heading up, trying to catch the tail end of the window. Every single rope change anchor point turned into a bottleneck of its own. Climbers clipped in and waiting on brutally steep terrain, while others carefully, painstakingly transferred from one rope segment to the next. Imran kept telling them, over and over, to take their time at every single transition. Kareem watched both climbers show increasingly obvious signs of exhaustion, their crampon placements getting sloppier, less precise. The kind of small technical degradation that means nothing on flat ground and means everything on a sheet of exposed ice. Conversation had basically stopped between everyone on that stretch of mountain. Nobody had breath to spare for talking. By the time they reached the bottleneck again on the way down, shadows had swallowed most of the slope, temperatures were dropping fast, and the softer snow that had cushioned the route earlier in the day had been scraped away by thousands of crampon points, leaving hard, polished blue ice exposed underneath.
There's a phrase experienced high-altitude climbers use that I keep thinking about while putting this episode together. Summit fever gets all the attention, but descent fatigue is the quiet killer.
Everyone worries about the version of a climber who pushes too hard to reach the top. Fewer people talk about the version who reaches the top just fine, celebrates, and then has to walk a tightrope back down on a body that's already spent most of its fuel. Shugo and Lucia weren't reckless on the way up in any way that would have raised alarms with an outside observer watching from a distance. They were reckless, if you can even call it that, in the much quieter, much more forgivable way of simply being human beings who wanted 20 extra minutes at the top of the hardest thing they'd ever done. It's the kind of choice thousands of climbers have made on thousands of summits without consequence. On this particular afternoon, on this particular mountain, it stacked on top of every other small deficit from the day and left almost no margin left for the descent. At one particular rope change anchor, exhausted climbers were supposed to clip into the next section of fixed line before fully releasing the one above it, overlapping the two just long enough to stay protected the whole time. It's a routine maneuver, done thousands of times every season without incident, when it's done in the right order. The queue at this anchor was inching forward one person at a time, and Lucia reached it first. Rushed and running on fumes, she unclipped from the upper rope before her new carabiner was properly seated on the line below. In that gap, one of her crampons skated across the exposed blue ice. She lost her balance instantly. Imran shouted for her to self-arrest, to dig in, to stop the slide before it started, though on hard blue ice, in crampons, mid-transition, that was never going to be an easy thing to do. Because she wasn't yet secured to the lower rope, there was nothing physically holding her in place, and nothing stopped that initial slide. Shugo, without any hesitation, lunged toward her before finishing his own transition. A purely instinctive reaction, the kind no training can fully suppress when you watch the person you love start to fall. His own carabiner wasn't yet locked onto the rope below, and that sudden shift of his weight downhill cost him his footing on the same treacherous ice. Kareem later said it happened in under 2 seconds. Both of them accelerated down the exposed slope below the bottleneck together, gear and headlamps scattering across the slope as they went, moving too fast for anyone nearby to even attempt to grab. Several climbers on that anchor watched, completely helpless, as the two of them disappeared more than 2,000 feet down the mountain into the growing darkness toward the glacier below. The climbers still at that anchor stood in silence for what witnesses described as several long moments after the fall. The kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, just the absence of words because there's nothing that could possibly be said. Nobody there was physically capable of mounting any kind of rescue attempt on that terrain, not in failing light, not at that altitude, not after their own bodies had already been pushed to the edge just getting themselves down. Imran and Kareem continued their own descent, visibly shaken, and once they reached the lower camps, they gave detailed statements to the expedition leadership and, later, to Pakistani authorities investigating the accident. Their accounts painted a consistent picture. Two competent, well-liked, genuinely careful climbers who had slowly, understandably, been consumed by the mounting pressure of a summit day that kept running later and later than anyone wanted. Recovery efforts were severely limited by the darkness, by the objective hazards of that exposed stretch below the bottleneck, and by the sheer scale of the fall. In the end, their bodies could not be safely recovered. Darkness, altitude, terrain, and distance made that impossible.
I've read through the investigators' notes on this one more than once, and there's a strange thing that happens when you sit with an accident report long enough. You start looking for the villain.
You want someone to have done something obviously, unforgivably stupid, because that would make the world feel a little more controllable, a little more predictable. If they just hadn't rushed the bottleneck, if they just listened to Gleb the second he opened his mouth, if they just skipped those 20 minutes on the summit, then this becomes a story about avoidable human error, rather than a story about how thin the margins really are up there. But I don't think that's honest. I think the far more uncomfortable truth is that Shugo and Lucia did almost everything right for years, built real skill and real judgment, climbing some of the most respected peaks in Europe, and still ran into a mountain that simply doesn't leave room for the small, deeply human mistakes that every other mountain forgives. That's not a satisfying ending. It's just the real one. What stays with me most is Gleb's warning near the bottleneck. The summit is only halfway. Hours later, it became the truest words spoken that day. K2 didn't claim Shugo and Lucia because they were reckless. It claimed them because, for a few critical minutes, exhaustion convinced two experienced climbers that hurrying was the safer choice.
And on that mountain, that particular mistake only gets made once.